Before we proceed, I just want to acknowledge that kluge-ruhe is located on the land of the Monica Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And since we're all joining from locations around the world, I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous nations where each of us are located. And I encourage you, if you don't know who those people are, that you find out and that you learn about them and their art and their culture. Welcome to the fourth webinar in a series where we are hearing from artists about their new and recent work, what it's been like for them in quarantine, and what new ideas they're exploring in their arts practice. I'm really excited to introduce Damien Shen to everyone today. I was honored to get to spend a lot of time with Damien during his residency at kluge-ruhe back in 2016, and I learned so much from him. I'll start with a very quick, brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to him. Damien Shen is a man of Aboriginal, Ngarrindjeri, and Chinese heritage who grew up outside of Adelaide. He holds a Bachelor's of Visual Communications and Illustration from the University of South Australia, and also a graduate certificate in management from the Australian Institute of Business. After working as a graphic designer and an art director and running his own business for 8 years, Damien left the creative industry to work in Aboriginal health and education. In 2013, he began his fine arts practice. Since then, his work has been acquired by the National Gallery of Australia and featured in more than 40 exhibitions around Australia. He has won multiple accolades: the South Australian NAIDOC Artist of the Year, the Prospect Portraiture Prize, and the 64th Blake Prize for Emerging Artists. He is represented by Mars Gallery in Melbourne. Without further delay, I'll hand it over to you, Damien.
So I guess I'll talk a little bit about, if you want to guide me, Lauren, as well, just what happened since I attended the residency in October 2016, and then where the work progressed after that, and sort of how COVID is all, messing with everyone at the moment. So as part of the residency that I did in October 2016, I was fortunate enough to be able to do some training around tintype photography from a photographer out of Richmond, Emily White. Awesome tintype photographer. And just before I left, I was fortunate enough to get access to the Gross Anatomy Lab in the University of Virginia, UVA, and was able to take in the darkroom into one of their classrooms there and photograph skeletal remains for a bit of an idea that I had. And so the images that came back, there were about six heroes, those sort of ones that ended up working properly. And that became the basis for a series that I titled Still Life After Penn, because I really enjoyed, or still enjoy, Irving Penn, the American photographer's artwork. Obviously he's a very renowned advertising photographer, but he also has like a fine arts practice and stuff like that. He didn't use tintypes, but he was very good at dynamic light and shade and that sort of thing, and the moods that were created through his portraiture or still life work. So I named this sort of still life series after him, and it spoke about the theft and repatriation of remains and how it relates to the Ngarrindjeri, which is on my mum's side, and how I'm able to, use art to talk about that history and also educate myself at the same time. So this image here was just one of a series of 6, and there was something. There's all these sort of personal visual cues in there as well, because from what I understand, the remains that were going out to universities came from one of 2 sources, being India and China. And I'm Chinese on my father's side, and the pipe reference in this is probably in some way a tribute to my grandfather, who used to sit in the lounge room, and I would actually light his pipe as a kid. Spent a lot of time, like my grandfather was like pretty much my father figure. And so there was this slight little thing, connection to, the Aboriginal remains theft, as well as the connection to, where these remains come from as well. So this work, I was very proud of. The original tintypes were acquired by a collector, which are just 4x5 inch plates, quite beautiful. And then these works went into a number of shows and prizes, whatnot. A little update on your introduction, Lauren. It's probably been about 80 shows since you had that 80? Update.
Wow.
So, yeah. So the way that, a lot of the work that I do, and because I'm not prolific, I've either editioned it or it's works that aren't initially created to sell. They tend to tour a lot. So that just helps me as an artist who is not constantly in the studio to maintain some sort of, I guess, I'll say relevance, but presence out in the sort of the art world. So, so after I came home from the residency, this work was finished because I had the original plates, and then I sort of worked them up more. I started to explore this idea of the dots over, textures over the top of an image, and then this idea of like erasure. So using dots as erasure as opposed to of adding something. They're subtracting, and that's where it sort of went into these. Oops, hang on. Went into these images. So this is one of two pretty large paintings that I reckon I started almost straight away when I got back. It wasn't that long after. This image is referenced from the Tyndale collection that was taken from people at the Raucan Mission, which was where my mum was born. And this is my great-grandfather. And on the next slide is my great-grandmother. All four of my great-grandparents were photographed by Tyndale when he did his anthropological study in the area. And, this idea of using dots is, I guess, I still feel there are certain kinds of protocols around the kinds of stories that people tell using the various patterns or symbology. And the Ngarrindjeri didn't really use dots. There's a lot of carving that was done. So if I've ever used dots sort of more recently, it's more to represent the actual carving patterns that I've seen on the shields that I've come across from the Murray region where Ngarrindjeri are from. But so these images are the start of something, I guess, where I imagined, these sort of ghostly figures, and part of through that process of the missions and, this anthropological sort of dissection, that was really, a huge loss of culture, and then, obviously the knock-on effect to that today. So this was the starting point, and I went through and what's the next one here? Oh yeah, that's another one. So these are oil paintings. That's a pretty well-known Ngarrindjeri image, and playing with the patterns. This is sort of very much the sort of patterns, carving patterns. Quite like that one, and then the next one here. That's George Taplin, who is the missionary who set up the Rauka mission where my mum was born. And he kept a meticulous diary, like daily entries between 1859 to 1879. So unless he was sick, he made an entry in a journal over a 20-year period, like every single day, and documented his interactions with the Ngarrindjeri, his observations of various customs, and how basically his mission was to convert everyone to Christianity. And that's a really, really interesting piece of history that is available for everyone to look at. Moving away, so I guess most of my work up until now was quite monochromatic. The charcoal drawings, the photography, very monochromatic. And this is where I started playing with a bit of colour. I'm not exactly sure why, but I think it was just a natural evolution. It might not seem like a big thing for some, but for somebody who's stuck in a very much a black and white world of photography and drawing and stuff, to break out and then go, oh, I'm going to use pink now, or whatever. That's sort of a felt like a big move. And it's always interesting when you create a series of work. You there's so many things that you have in your mind that you've loaded into this stuff, and then you get the opportunity to hear other people's take on it. And one of them was like the use of the dots, the pink dots. Some people felt like, oh, maybe that's like a reference to smallpox or some sort of, some sort of plague or pandemic, that was wiping people out. And it's so bizarre how we've come back around to it, like this idea of a pandemic and at the moment. So this is a work that, or an ongoing collaboration with a friend of mine, a Melbourne artist named Robert Haig, who is an incredible sculptor and lithographer, as well as just like a super creative dude. So this body of work, the working title for it is Where We Meet. And it still falls in line with some of the core themes of my practice, which is, the observation of how science was used to analyze people, and science was used to try to understand, Aboriginality, or, and, in Tyndale's example, one of his books was about, it was titled A Survey of the Half-Caste Problem in South Australia, which he was trying to work out how long does it take for an Aboriginal person to have their blood quantum diluted down to the point where they are no longer distinguishable as Aboriginal in community, and they just sort of fit into like the mainstream world, and using science to sort of work all that out. So this series of work is between Robert and I. We're using science to work out what our differences are, but sort of referencing the old methods. So the cases here, they're direct life casts of our heads and limbs, and which refers to, I guess, the history of the theft of remains, and where physicians would take body parts and then send them overseas and do all sorts of stuff. So these to me, when you see them close up, they're just these amazing, beautiful pieces of resin that are so detailed. As we've so we've got the limbs. We went and got X-rays of our heads. You'll see those in the background. So I got some X-rays front and side, and so did Robert. We did our DNA, and we've got DNA profiles, and we've done hair samples, and there's in the background, it's going to be very difficult to see, but you can see these sort of, they're little tintypes, and one is like the front on and the side on, very much in the vein of how Tyndale would photograph people on the mission. And it's like a, Vernon Marquis has referred to that kind of imagery in his drawings, where you'll see the number sort of card on the side coming in, and then the person's, it's effectively like a mugshot. So we created them using the tintypes, and it just dates them 100 years instantly, which is like a really beautiful thing about that photographic method, is it just, as soon as the image is created, it just takes you back in time. So you can have a lot of fun playing with that perspective. Oh, here's a nice shot of one of the body parts a bit closer up, and that's my head. Some people find it quite confronting to have things that are so realistic, and yeah, I just imagine that, it would be nice to feel that relaxed.
That quite echoes with your drawing practice, though, that hyperrealism. So in some ways, I'm not totally surprised by that.
So I'm not sure what the slide I've got next is. Oh yeah. So some of the drawings that I had done, and some that were on display in the kluge-ruhe, well, I've still got most of those drawings, and I didn't feel like, when I started it, because it was like the first series I did back in 2013 when I started my practice, I didn't feel like it had reached its end conclusion, and that's for a number of reasons, mainly being that I had all these other ideas that I wanted to incorporate in some sort of installation. And at that point in time, I didn't have the skills or the know-how to sort of bring it all together. There were audio components. There were these interviews that I'd done with, all of my family members about their time on the mission, and etc. I started exploring I guess it would have sort of just been a natural progression from the skulls, where looking at the anatomy and the dissection of everything, and how that relates to identity. And for the more recent show that I created, it was created in two streams. One stream was the drawings of my family, and this idea of sort of like the etched overlay. So the lines that you see on these tintypes are engraved with a tool, and the images are actually, I've created tintypes of the drawings, and so I'd sit down after and engrave it. So there's a full series of that, and as one stream of this show. So just to backtrack a little bit, I've been creating work and been in, a whole stack of different group shows and whatnot since the kluge-ruhe time. And then in the last Tanandi Art Festival, which is held in Adelaide, I did it was like a mentorship with Glenn, Isiga Pilkington. Was it? Oh God, I always get it wrong. We got to spend some time together in Canberra and look at all these different archives, and the start of that work, it was based around this idea of adornment, and how does adornment create hierarchy in communities and in groups. And more namely, this idea of the king plates that were handed out to different communities during the time of colonization, and how they were used to manipulate groups. So that was like the starting point of the conversation and our investigation. So we went to Canberra, looked at all this various archives at the museum, at the NGA, and then, funnily enough, I came across a whole bunch of Chinese stuff while we were sort of pursuing this other information, and we sat down and thought, well, I haven't really done a lot talking about this idea of my, bicultural existence on this planet. And so I figured, oh, well, I'm going to have a shot and try and articulate something through some new work. So for the Tanandi Festival, actually, I'm not sure if I've got the works on this slide, but there are images that were in the solo show, and the idea is that I combined sort of this ancient archival sort of imagery of China around the Song dynasty period, which is where the Shen family name sort of came out of, and that's about 900 AD. So that was quite a there was a lot of culture developing at that stage, and I think during the Song dynasty they may have even developed gunpowder and bombs or whatever. So a lot was going on then, and I found all this beautiful imagery, and one in particular which I saw in Canberra was an emperor on a horse, and I thought, well, I would love to sort of be a little bit playful with it and create this idea of like this self-portraiture as me in some way being like the army guy or the emperor, because of the way adornment was used in that, and which signifies hierarchy, and it's very much a Chinese thing as well.
Damien, can you just explain what king plates are in case some of our participants aren't aware of that history? Because that's a really interesting connection between adornments as a Chinese symbol of status and then the way that the British colonists used that to manipulate Aboriginal people.
Yeah. So the king plates were these plates that were worn around the neck, and they were in a, if you can imagine, like a very sort of expanded boomerang shape with holes on each side, and there would be a chain that would go around your neck. And they were customized and would say, king of, whatever area, and it would list the name, and they would often find the most influential person in the community, be it an elder or whoever, and they would grant them this plate, and as a way to create this false hierarchy within that clan structure. And the reason why that was done was to be able to take land, and to be able to gain favor with the different clans, using the influence of the leader to manipulate and to get access to the things that they needed to do. Some people really sort of embrace this idea of that they were being elevated by the white man, and others really source through that tactic of manipulation. And it's a pretty interesting history. So instantly, as we were sort of spending the nights together, Glenn and I, after we'd been out all day looking at things, those threads started to come together around the Chinese idea of adornment and the way the emperors were dressed, and the classic sort of Chinese ancestral portraiture that's done of people sitting on the chairs and wearing all their stuff, and so.
Just out of curiosity, was that the first time that like a link like that you felt like was made, or that was embedded within your work between these two sort of sides of your heritage? Because I know you've done portraits in the past of both sides of your family, but in terms of like sort of combining them in one work, is this the first time that that's happened?
Yeah. So that's
Really cool. And for those
to
who
combine.
don't know, Glenn, who he's talking about, is a curator. He's an Aboriginal curator, and he's actually on our advisory council at kluge-ruhe. So we're really grateful for all of his advice and help.
Yeah, super wonderful guy. Like really intelligent, really knows how to articulate his understandings of things, and can also just soak in a huge volume of information, and then poetically articulate that in such a beautiful way. Like we've worked together a bit lately, and yeah, he's so talented. I wonder if he's watching. So yeah, it is the first time that I've so overtly combined both those elements of my cultural background. I don't know if people do it a lot, but I just felt that it was a good time, and given the experience from the residency or the mentorship with Glenn, it was just screaming out for it. So for the Tanandi work, I'd actually gone and made these red frames in like the middle frame was like the symbol of prosperity, and had them cut out. I did think I should have put that on there last night, but I completely forgot because it was almost midnight and I was getting a bit tired. But
No worries.
It's on my Instagram if you want to have a look. Custom made these frames, had them CNC cut out of MDF, and then sprayed in 2-pack paint, like kitchen paint, and that formed the basis of like a triptych showing there was Uncle Moogie in there's my kids, and then there's me in the center as this idea of like the emperor. And I think so this is an example. The title of the work, actually I can't remember what the title of this one is. The title of the show is Stone from Another Mountain. And that relates to, it's like a bit of a Chinese proverb, which talks about this idea of things that are foreign, the stone from the other mountain, and the full length version of that I guess quote is something like stone from another mountain can polish your jade. So you can use these things that are unknown from other areas to help improve yourself. That's sort of how most people read that particular phrase, and but then also, you know, I look at it on the other side of that, maybe a little bit more cynically, and think, well, you know, quite often things that are unknown seem quite impressive if you don't have a decent understanding of it, and then it's quite easy to glance over and go, oh wow, that's really cool. And not really spend the time and try to understand these things. So that I sort of take that the parable or the quote in two ways. So this idea of, you know, combining this imagery, you know, obviously I've looked into it a lot, but there's probably a lot of people who won't. They will just see it on face value and go, oh wow, that's really unique, or you know, combining this idea of culture and this archival imagery. The background here is photographed. I went down and shot from the Coorong, which is where Ngarrindjeri are from. So it's like the homelands. It's a reference to Chinese ancestry. It's a reference to Ngarrindjeri sort of shield. So those patterns on the armor are like carvings on shields, which I then engrave in. And using the tintype process, which I've been just continually developing over that time since kluge-ruhe days, 2016. I really feel like it's come to a place. Like I destroyed so many attempts at finding where this needed to sort of sit, and where it's at now is somewhere that I think is, I don't know, I can't say absolutely unique because I'm sure other people are doing it. And I know some people do this idea of like engraving onto a tintype, but doing it the way that I do it, I just haven't seen too many examples. So I'm pretty happy with where this part of my practice evolved, and that's taken a lot of time. So it's one of my sort of, I guess, tips or recommendations for younger artists trying to feel like they need to get somewhere quickly. Quite often, things evolve organically. You can't put a time frame on it. It arrives at a point when it's ready, and this is one of those things that just I felt like arrived at a point.
So I just want to make sure I understand that the audience does as well, because what you're doing here is so interesting. So you've basically photographed yourself robed in traditional Song Dynasty Chinese regalia or body ornamentation, and photographed yourself on your Aboriginal country, and then etched over the actual tintype itself, which is a reductive process or a carving process, which is what your Aboriginal ancestors would have done, right? With those Ngarrindjeri designs. So it's like the adornment and the way that even like the posture that you're in is that Song Dynasty Chinese style, but then the landscape and the physical, like your physical action on the plate is harnessing more of that Aboriginal ancestry. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
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 Cool.
It's really combining.
Cool. Yeah, it's really
it's combining all of that.
Yeah.
I have a particular method of creating the imagery, which is maybe a little bit of a trade secret, because
you don't
anyone
have to tell us, it's okay.
anyone who knows how to make tintypes knows that it's almost impossible to create an image like this unless you have a certain method. So I'm no David Copperfield, but it's something that I've had to sort of work out a little bit. And I think the last image on this slide is probably the hero shot of the exhibition, which is that one where I've completely referenced the image of the emperor, but sort of superimposed me so as a self-portrait in there, and then done the engraving as well, and it's in the background. And this is probably one of my favorites, and works good at a small scale, works great at a big scale, and it's hard to explain how these look in real life unless you've just seen them, because they're very small works, 4 by 5 inches, and they're just so beautiful to hold in your hand, especially when once I've finished them, I varnish them, so they'll have this like gloss varnish over the top, and they just look so beautiful. Most of the last 12 months has been sort of focused around on tintypes, and just achieving a body of work for an exhibition that I think, from memory, opened in May in Melbourne, just as everything was going into lockdown. So I couldn't even attend my own opening, which was disappointing. I had a little
disappointing, really disappointing.
Yeah, I was so looking forward to it, and I'd organised a little family getaway that weekend, and we're actually going to be on holiday as well just before that, at some caravan park thing. So everything got cancelled. The show still went ahead, and but it was by appointment only, and but as a result, I don't think there was a lot of foot traffic, and everybody at that time was probably just working out how to make sense of it all, let alone go see an art exhibition, and all that sort of stuff. So I can completely understand as to why, why my show sort of went the way it did, and also have sympathy for every other artist who was showing pretty much at the same time, because we probably all experienced the same sort of outcome. Having said that, the work's been embraced by people, and it's nice to get feedback. And this particular method, one of your board members came to the Darwin, the Telstra show.
Yeah, he's watching. He's
yeah.
Today. Hey, Mark.
Yeah, how you going?
Yeah.
And he really liked the work and sort of reached out. So that was really special. So
yeah. Do you want to update everybody on what you've been working on since COVID-19 hit? Because I think a lot of the audience, a lot of our participants are local to here right now, and so I think they'd be interested to hear a little bit about what that work has been like.
Yeah. So in terms of art or my day job?
Day job. I mean, both, but day job too.
Yeah. So
why you're in that office building right now?
Yeah. So I normally work in the drug and alcohol sector, and tobacco control and marketing and stuff. But I was seconded around 2 months ago over into the main sort of Office of Health, into our the emergency response team for the COVID, the pandemic, I guess, for South Australia. So I'm right in the middle now of everything that's happening with how the health department and the other stakeholders are keeping South Australia safe from future outbreaks and stuff like that. Like, fortunately, in South Australia, we're very lucky that we don't have we never did have a lot of numbers to start with in terms of cases, but it's pretty much down to nothing out in the community, and just a few sort of as the international arrivals, like Australians returning back to Australia from overseas. But they're going into quarantine straight away. So that's a process that probably familiar to most. Most parts of every part of Australia that I know of. I'm not sure what's happening over in the States, but so yeah, I'm working on planning and on just getting involved in a few operations, and yeah, it's just eye-opening. And while the pandemic is not great, it is really rewarding work that has it's time consuming, and therefore it's had some impact on my practice. But I'll be able to look back on this period of time and just say, hey, I made a contribution. And the thing you can, people tell me, and this is like any other thing that can sometimes get in the way of your practice. It's like the art will always be there, and I've developed my practice enough to be able to return without too many issues after small periods of time off.
You have kids too, and you're raising a family. And
yeah. So I've got my family, and we're trying to, the kids are resilient. They just do whatever. So,
Damien, can you just share like what's been the hardest thing for you being on that task force, and maybe the most surprising or hopeful thing that you've seen as part of that?
The hardest thing. Well, all I can say, I'll think about that. But then the most hopeful part is that the people that I work with in this particular group are so hardworking. They're so mission orientated and willing to pick up any piece of work that's required, that I don't think people realize like how much work goes in behind the scenes to try to make things safer. there's a lot of dedicated people within here that they pull some seriously long hours to make things happen and keep an eye on certain things and plan for the next, bit of work. That to me makes me hopeful, knowing that these people are my colleagues now, and I get to know them like really closely through the work that we do. Because it's a great team of hardworking people. The most difficult part, I don't know. Health, I think, in general, is just a difficult area. It's running health departments in various states. Like South Australia is a small state. I can't imagine what it's like in Victoria. Victoria, as you'd see on the news, are starting to have these little sort of outbreaks of, our numbers are nothing like, say, New York, but we're 70 cases identified in a day is a lot, as opposed to like 1,000 or something, or but that's a massive state. So that and health is so unpredictable at times with how the response needs to be created and managed, and planning for all the various outcomes that can happen. That's actually probably the most difficult part of it, is preparing for the unknown at times.
Yeah, thanks for answering that. Mark says, greetings to Damien. The beautiful tintype he had bought is in a place of honor in his living room.
So, wonderful to hear.
It is possible to buy Damien's work, everyone. So if you're interested, you should pursue that via Mars Gallery. Terry Snowball, who is also on our advisory council. Man, all this advisory council support on this webinar. Thanks to you all. Terry says, hey, what's up, my brother? During your extended stay here in the States, there were several things you wanted to bring back home with you as inspiration or research. Was that accomplished to your satisfaction?
Oh, look, I reckon I'm still sort of, I don't think I'll stop distilling that experience. That it's what I would consider the best experience I've had as an artist is doing the kluge-ruhe residency, even to date, like hands down the best. I have a massive photographic archive from my time in Charlottesville, when I spent time with Terry in DC. Then I went over and spent about 3.5 weeks in Jersey, like New Jersey. Where was I? Sort of close to Jersey City, and then into New York every day. Went back over to LA for another about 2.5, 3 weeks, down to San Diego and stuff. So that the whole experience was over a 3-month period was just amazing. The friendships that I gained and people that I still keep in contact with, and yeah, there are things that I still want to pursue, and it's a matter of like time and resourcing. I've got some ideas, and sometimes it's just like, okay, how do I finance this thing that's going to cost potentially like 10 or 20 grand to make? And then artists are always faced with those sort of issues of how big can you think? Well, you can only think as big as you can potentially afford to pay for.
Yeah.
And it's like, you see these wonderful installations in huge galleries. It's like, well, someone they probably got a grant, and they get those size grants because they're at a certain profile level, and just it is what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about your photographic archive from being at kluge-ruhe on the residency, because I know that you were talking about how you couldn't get into the cadaver labs. So for those of you who don't know, Damien was able to tour some cadaver labs, and when he was here at the University of Virginia Medical School, and you were talking about how that was kind of impossible to do in Australia, and then also there was the oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the Italian name, the Vesalius test.
Oh yeah.
that you looked at as well. That was pretty, because that was an original copy that the medical library had. So yeah, it's interesting. I would also say you remember Rue as being like one of the most like voracious artists of just like wanting to explore as much as you could in that short period of time and be exposed to as much. So that's cool. I'm glad. I think like UC's as much of it was about how you sees the opportunity as it was what we were able to provide. But there's a question that we have here, which is, has your work been influenced by that of Kehinde Wiley?
I became a fan after seeing his work, and I saw it at a lot of different venues as I was traveling around. These just huge paintings, so bright, hyper real, and like the framing on them was just, so it was all stunning. I think I started to think about him quite a bit when I got back. Probably not so much these days as the artists that I think about still a lot from that time. Well, Kerry James Marshall, who is still one of my favorite of all time, and I follow him, and I love his painting style. But there's a guy that I've come across, Henry Taylor, who is I think based in LA, African American guy, in his 70s, I think. So it's his explosion sort of happened quite late in his practice, and I think as my practice progresses, and as Lauren stated before, my drawings were always quite detailed, and the paintings quite detailed. I'm trying to break away from that, and I feel like it's almost some kind of unshackling to this idea that everything has to be detailed for it to be good. Whereas I feel like you can say more with less, and one gesture with a paintbrush can create a feeling that you can't do with 5 hours of rendering an eye or something. So I'm really trying to explore that, the side of what, how do you make people feel a certain way with a technique, as opposed to impress people with in a way that, the detailed stuff I think is impressive because people can relate in their own mind. I can only draw a stick figure. I'd never be able to draw like that. And that's what impresses people. I want to sort of explore other emotions through the work these days. And as such, it's, Kehinde Wiley is probably not my main sort of source of inspiration these days, but amazing artist nonetheless.
So that's really interesting, because what you're pointing to is this idea that, making naturalistic work and like impressing people with skill gets, like, it almost stops them rather than doing something else, which encourages almost more investigation in a way. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And that I think that to have what I'd consider, a serious practice is one where you've got to be prepared to take a few risks and deviate away at times from, what you consider is a successful element of what you do, because you can get stuck in a slipstream of the kind of work that works. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think the beauty of art and the beauty of being an artist is that you should be feeling slightly on the edge and coming across these new ideas and spending time in the studio where, for 6 months you might not release anything. People might not see those mistakes, but then you arrive at that point, and when you get there, it feels amazing.
Damien, the mark of a good artist is one who's courageous enough to leave something that's already still working. But we have someone who says, your work is always so thoughtful. I feel like the time you have spent away from making art because of job and family allows you to slowly develop your ideas in your head. So when they come out, they are deep and rich. Nice compliment.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And yes, I spend a lot of time in my head thinking about this.
We have a really interesting question that came in a few minutes ago from Zahara. She says, I am an 11-year-old African-American girl. I love photography and I have been taking photos since I was a little child. Fun fact, my mom taught Emily White when she was in middle school. We stayed in touch, and Emily gave me my first little camera. She was also at my birth. Wow. Do you have any advice for me as a growing African-American photographer? Also, I have a question about how you deal with racism, question mark.
Okay. My advice is, and you know, this is something that if you followed Emily's Instagram or something, you notice that she's just continuously making and just continuously photographing. She works in tintypes. She shoots on 35mm. She's just continuously just making imagery, and that's one of those things. You could there's ways to keep ideas I guess fresh. I think there's probably like creative idea books that tell you, okay, well, for 1 week shoot 100 photos about this theme, and that, while it might sound a little bit, you know, you don't want to get pushed into things that you don't want to do, it's actually a really good way to flex that creative muscle, and a technical muscle too, where you are having to become the master of your craft over a period of time, and that is through repetition and through discipline, and also through that repetition and discipline, you also it fires off various things in your mind, and you start to query and question other things. So firstly, you know, become a master of your craft, understand your tools. Secondly, one of the most unique things about being an artist is your own story. Now, as a young person, you know, I came into art almost in my 40s, so I've had obviously a lot of life experience. But you might feel, I don't have a lot to talk about, but you've got your family's stories to talk about. You've got your community stories to talk about. You could go and start interviewing people, find some themes, and create images around those themes. You know, they're just like little ideas to get you going. And but yeah, I'm sure you've got so much to be able to talk about.
She had the second part of her question, which is like, how do you deal with racism in your practice?
Yeah. Look, for me, racism, I experienced a lot of it when I was younger. You know, being Chinese and Aboriginal, I could get it from both angles. You know, in high school, when I first started, I got picked on, bullied, assaulted. And, you know, last night while I was walking back to my car after work, these two young lads were walking down the street, and in front of me was this Chinese guy on his phone, just minding his own business. And these young guys just started, well, at least one of them made like really quite out there, loud, racist remarks towards this guy. And I was just behind, and my blood pressure just went up instantly, and I didn't do anything. I said, all right, because I don't think that the guy on the phone even realized, because he was just talking and minding his own business. And I saw that. I was like, man, it's so disappointing to see. Like, I know it's out there, and you know, we try to make a difference in Australia, but it's always sits under that sort of surface, that veneer of society where you know, something happens and it just rises up again. I guess for me, because I understand what it feels like to be in that position and to be a victim of that, I feel like I have a little bit more resilience, and you can use it as fuel. Use it as fuel to create. you can tell those stories, those experiences. That's how I tend to think about it nowadays. Is that's a story to tell now. You know, I'm not going to let it get me down. I'm going to tell a story, and then maybe someone else will see that through art, which is such a beautiful way to engage people. You can stop them in their tracks, draw them in for a bit, and then you can share a story that might, at one point, make somebody change their attitude.
Beautiful, beautiful. One last question from Ashley. She says, hello, Damien. My practice is concerned with the politics of belonging, and this is the place from which I ask the following questions. Do you think that your work returns your cultural heritage to that of being captured or owned through the beautiful objects you create within and for the art market? What do you think about the notion that these objects in the hands of those outside of your cultural heritages continue to contribute to the fetishization of the other, particularly for those who you have mentioned who don't seek to know of the deeper histories behind your work? I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, I added some things in there.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, yeah, the idea of things being taken, remains being taken, studied, fetishized. Does the work sort of continue that? You know, I don't feel like I've arrived.
Sorry, Ashley is a he. I'm sorry, Ashley. He is interested. Sorry,
okay.
Without saying so.
Sorry. Sorry, my friend. I don't think I've arrived anywhere. You know, in terms of a place of belonging and like this identity. For me, it continues to. What's the best word to use? Evolving's, I don't think, not the right word, but I'd say more so like my understanding of myself expands, because we're very, like, everybody is a complex being. All the bits that make us up, our families, the cultural heritage that sort of branches off from all of that is so complicated. And I didn't actually think too hard about it until I was sort of late 20s, you know, getting into my 30s. Very sort of, as a young person, I was doing a lot of music and just having a great time. I see this idea of being able to share my work that talks about identity and talks about belonging and touches on these sort of themes that you've mentioned as an opportunity to educate. For a long time, I had this an unwritten business plan in my head. For the first 3 years, I would not sell any work. Okay, so this idea of having to get work into people's homes, it was not even on the radar for me. Now, so within that 3-year period, I just wanted to try and achieve a few things and tell a story and whatnot. And, now that sort of went a bit faster than I was expecting, and then at some point there becomes a collector who's interested. They go, oh, I really like the work, and people will buy things for all sorts of reasons, not just the fact that it talks about you know, a certain cultural aspect. They might buy it just because they think it is a beautiful drawing. Like, I've had people just purely buy the work based off of that. It's a beautiful drawing and I wish I could draw like that sort of thing. However, once the work gets into the home and people then start to track your progress, they begin to listen to the conversations that you have. And that is where I think the sort of the powerful part of it happens for me. And I do agree to some aspect that it could contribute to this, ongoing idea of cultural matter being sort of taken away and being put into people's homes, and potentially discussed at dinner parties or whatever, and and I've observed that kind of thing myself, but I think there's the bigger conversation for me is to explain the history, and hopefully people understand. So I don't get it all right, but I do the best I can.
I'll just chime in there and say, I think there's a lot of ways that your work resists that kind of, that treatment. I think partially because you're engaging with, both sides of your cultural heritage. I think a lot of people want to think of Aboriginal people as one thing. And because you're making an Aboriginal people as like one thing, and Beyond the Beatson says we are all many things, right? Like we all are many things. And I just think that the fact that you're drawing from both heritages and using and really reclaiming a Western photographic practice, right, for your own voice are all ways that your work kind of resists that treatment in a way. But I don't know. That's my 2 cents. Well, that's all the questions. So I think we'll wrap up. Damien, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your work with us today. Ashley said, thanks, Damien. I really appreciate your answer. So that's cool.
Yeah, you're welcome, mate.
And thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate you spending time with us this evening. Again, if you wanted to share this recording with anyone that you think might be interested, we will have it on the kluge-ruhe YouTube channel, hopefully by tomorrow. Somebody else says thank you, and someone says, Damien, you are a natural, a gifted teacher. Robin says, very inspired by your talk. Thanks. So thanks so much, everyone.
I miss the Charlottesville community a lot, and hopefully one day I'll get back and with the same level of energy that I was there at the first time.
We would love to have you back someday. Just got to figure that out. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.